The woods of North Carolina have always known how to keep secrets. Long before the highways cut through the hills and long before outsiders learned which paths not to walk after sunset, those trees learned to watch quietly. On a fog-heavy morning, when the ash from a burned cabin still clung to the air like a held breath, two girls emerged from between the pines. They were holding hands. They were uninjured. And they were far too beautiful for what they had survived. Their names were Edith and Flora. No one could say exactly how old they were. Their faces looked carved rather than grown, pale and smooth, untouched by hunger, smoke, or grief. While the forest around them smelled of death and damp earth, the sisters stood clean, calm, and strangely unafraid. They did not cry for the caretakers who had vanished in the fire. They did not ask where they would sleep that night. They simply watched the men who found them, eyes reflecting the trees as if the woods had followed them out. The town took them in, because that is what towns like this have always done. But kindness quickly gave way to discomfort. Animals refused to come near them. Dogs whimpered. Horses reared. At night, people swore they heard soft footsteps circling their homes, though Edith and Flora were always exactly where they were supposed to be. The sisters spoke little, but when they did, their words landed wrong, too precise, too old, as if borrowed from mouths that no longer existed. Whispers began before questions. Some said the girls were touched by tragedy. Others said they were touched by something else entirely. Records failed to explain them. Fires followed them. And the woods, which had watched them arrive, seemed to lean closer each time someone tried to uncover the truth. The fire was already dying when they found the cabin, its blackened ribs jutting from the clearing like the remains of some large, burned animal. Smoke clung low to the ground, drifting between the trees as if unwilling to leave. The cabin had stood far from any road, deep enough in the woods that only hunters, trappers, and the occasional desperate soul ever passed near it. No one could remember exactly who lived there, only that an older couple had taken in two orphaned girls years earlier and had not been seen much since. When the smell of smoke finally reached the nearest farms, it was already too late for shouting or saving. Men arrived with lanterns and rifles, expecting to find bodies, or at least the remains of them. Instead, they found silence. The fire had consumed almost everything inside the cabin, but there were no bones in the ash, no shapes that suggested human forms had burned there. The ground was scorched in a wide circle, as though the flames had risen unnaturally fast, leaving no time for escape. That was when someone noticed movement at the tree line, where the forest thickened and the fog gathered like breath held in a mouth. Two figures stepped forward slowly, barefoot on cold soil, hands linked as if they had rehearsed this moment. They did not look burned. They did not look frightened. Their clothes were clean, pale dresses untouched by smoke or soot, swaying gently as though they had walked out of a dream rather than a disaster. One of the men lowered his lantern, convinced for a moment that his eyes were lying to him. Children did not walk away from fires like this. Not without scars. Not without screaming. When asked where they had come from, the girls answered in unison, voices soft and steady, giving their names as Edith and Flora. They said the cabin was gone now, as if it had simply moved away on its own. When asked about the people who lived with them, the girls only looked back toward the trees, their expressions unreadable, almost patient. No footprints led from the cabin to the forest, yet there they stood, as if placed carefully at the edge of the clearing. The men wrapped blankets around their shoulders, though the girls did not shiver. One of them commented that they were too clean, too calm, too composed for orphans pulled from a burning home. Another noticed that neither girl smelled of smoke. The forest behind them remained unnaturally quiet, no insects, no birds, as though something unseen was listening closely. When they were finally led away from the ruins, Edith and Flora did not look back at the cabin, not once, their attention fixed instead on the path ahead, on the town that believed it was rescuing two helpless children, unaware that whatever had survived that fire had not truly come from it. From the moment the townspeople first laid eyes on Edith and Flora, a quiet unease settled over the room like smoke. It was not just their survival that seemed improbable, it was their appearance, almost otherworldly in its perfection. The sisters were impossibly symmetrical, their features so precise that no artist could have painted them without feeling the weight of something unnatural. Their skin held a luminous quality, pale yet untouched by the hardships that any child raised in the woods would inevitably bear. Cheeks that should have been flushed from hunger were instead smooth and untouched. Hair, long and fine, fell in dark waves that caught the light as if it had never been tangled or washed with anything less than care. Even the small scars and bruises of ordinary childhood seemed to avoid them entirely, as though the world had decided to preserve their form for some purpose beyond comprehension. Eyes were the most disturbing. Deep, dark, and knowing, they seemed to hold memories too old for the years the girls claimed. When Edith glanced at someone, it felt as though she could see their every thought, every regret, every secret they had tried to bury. Flora's gaze carried a quiet challenge, a weight that seemed far too deliberate for a child who had spent her life hidden away. The combination of innocence and an eerie awareness unsettled even the most rational adults. Conversations in hushed tones began almost immediately. Neighbors whispered about the two perfect children and exchanged worried glances, wondering what manner of upbringing or perhaps otherworldly intervention had kept them so untouched. It was not just their physical appearance that unnerved the town, but the subtle ways in which they defied ordinary experience. The girls moved without hesitation, stepping over broken branches or rough stones without a sound, as though the forest itself parted for them. In the evenings, the shadows seemed to cling to them differently than to anyone else, lingering in odd patterns on the walls or the ground. Their presence altered the air, a delicate, imperceptible tension that made conversations halt and hearts quicken. Even the local children hesitated when they approached Edith and Flora, unsure why they felt both drawn and repelled. Rumors began to circulate that the girls were not merely survivors, but something else entirely, beings who belonged to the woods as much as they did to the human world, or perhaps not at all. Stories of other children who disappeared, of legends whispered in the hills, were dredged from memory and applied to these new arrivals, though nothing matched them precisely. Everyone sensed the impossibility, that Edith and Flora had survived alone, untouched, unscarred, and with a presence so powerful it bent the reality of the small town to accommodate them, as though they had stepped out of the shadows of the forest not by chance but by design. Despite the horrors they had supposedly endured, Edith and Flora exhibited a composure that no child could naturally sustain. There were no tears, no trembling limbs, no cries of fear. The fire had consumed everything, yet they emerged from the wreckage as if untouched not only by the flames but by grief itself. Adults struggled to reconcile the scene in the clearing with the calm, almost deliberate way the girls carried themselves. When asked about the fire, their answers were quiet, measured, almost rehearsed. They spoke of shadows and voices, of things moving with the smoke, but never of pain or terror. It was as if they had watched from a distance, spectators to a world that had destroyed their home while leaving them unharmed. Onlookers noted that even the cold did not bother them. Wrapped in only thin dresses, they stood barefoot on the frost-stung earth without shivering, their skin retaining a warmth that seemed unnatural in the crisp mountain air. The men who rescued them, bundled in heavy coats and shaking with chill, could not comprehend how such fragility could coexist with such resilience. Every instinct to comfort or protect was confronted by a quiet defiance in the girls' demeanor. They did not need warmth, they did not need reassurance, and they did not seem to seek safety. Their presence challenged the very laws of nature, leaving the adults uneasy in a way that mere survival could not account for. The town attempted to coax memories from them, pressing gently for details of the night of the fire, but the sisters offered only fragments, a sense of movement, a distant crackle, the feeling of being watched, and yet, not a single detail that would explain the flames or the fate of the adults they had lived with. When pressed, they would repeat the same cryptic words, that they weren't alone during the fire, leaving listeners with the haunting certainty that something unseen had accompanied them, something that had perhaps guided their steps out of death's reach. There was a growing unease among those who encountered them, a sense that the girls' composure was not merely remarkable but impossible. Children were meant to scream, to flinch, to collapse under trauma. These girls did none of those things. Instead, they observed, they noted, and they waited, their movements deliberate, their expressions unsettlingly calm. Even the adults, seasoned in tragedy and hardship, felt the weight of something foreign in their presence, as if Edith and Flora carried a secret too vast and unknowable to share. Their silence became its own kind of language, an unspoken warning that the world they had survived was not one governed by the rules ordinary people understood, and that the fire had revealed not weakness, but something far more enigmatic lurking within the sisters. It didn't take long for the townspeople to notice that Edith and Flora's presence changed everything around them. Animals, usually unbothered by the arrival of humans, reacted to the girls in ways that unsettled even the most skeptical observers. Dogs that had been loyal for years would whimper and retreat into corners when the sisters entered a room, their ears flat and tails tucked, as though sensing some intangible danger. Cats hissed from the shadows, refusing to approach even when food was offered. Horses, normally steady and obedient, would rear and shy whenever the girls came near, stamping the ground in panic and snorting as though warning invisible predators. Farmers whispered that livestock had never behaved this way, that no child could carry such an influence without intention, yet no malice seemed present in Edith or Flora. They merely existed, and the world around them shifted. The incidents did not stop with animals. Families who attempted to foster the sisters reported other, more subtle disturbances that gnawed at the edges of reason. Mirrors would crack without impact, hairline fractures that seemed to spread like spiderwebs from no discernible source. Doors slammed when no wind stirred, and windows rattled though the air outside remained still. Nights became restless. Parents awoke to the sensation of soft footsteps moving across their floors, though when they turned on lamps or lanterns, the girls were always seated in their chairs, silent and observing, as if the sound had originated from somewhere else entirely. Some reported hearing whispers in rooms where only silence should have existed, words too faint to understand yet heavy with meaning, and always in the presence of Edith or Flora. Even the neighbors, those who had initially welcomed the children with caution, began to notice the dreamlike, disorienting effect the sisters had on people. Hikers passing near the foster homes reported vivid, unsettling dreams of the girls standing at the foot of their beds, eyes dark and unblinking, watching with a patience that felt eternal. Those dreams often lingered long after waking, leaving the adults with an inexplicable anxiety that the children were still present even when nowhere to be seen. Attempts to explain the phenomena rationally failed. Psychologists and social workers suggested heightened sensitivity, trauma responses, or coincidence, but the pattern was undeniable. Every home the girls entered experienced disturbances of a similar nature. Animals, objects, and even the boundaries of sleep itself seemed to respond to the sisters' presence. Townsfolk began speaking in hushed tones, the words barely leaving their lips, warning newcomers that the children were not ordinary, that something about their beauty and composure carried a weight that could not be measured or contained, a quiet power that demanded attention and commanded fear in equal measure, leaving no one untouched who crossed their path. From the earliest days at school, Edith and Flora's intelligence set them apart. Though it was more than just intelligence, it was the kind that unsettled adults and peers alike. The teacher first noticed it in simple ways. The girls recited local history with a precision that no book could teach them, describing events that had faded from memory, naming families long vanished from the town, and recounting tragedies that had been whispered only in rumor. Their pronunciation was flawless, their tones matter-of-fact, and their timing precise, as if they were not merely repeating what they had been told but recalling it from personal experience. The teacher would pause, pen hovering over attendance sheets, caught between admiration and disbelief, wondering how two girls raised in isolation could possess such a depth of knowledge. It became clear that they did not merely know history, they understood it. When the class studied the founding of the county, Edith and Flora added details that no text contained, filling in gaps in the narratives of old families, abandoned homesteads, and lost children. They spoke of events that had occurred decades before their births, in a tone that implied observation rather than hearsay. The teacher questioned them gently, asking how they had learned such things, but the girls only smiled slightly and said they remembered what was told by the trees and the wind. The statement made the adults around them uneasy, though it sounded innocent enough when whispered in the context of imaginative children. Other students noticed too. Children would sit wide-eyed during lessons as the sisters corrected subtle errors in stories their parents had told them, or asked questions that revealed an awareness of events too intricate for ordinary comprehension. They spoke in ways that suggested both curiosity and authority, asserting knowledge that seemed inherited from some source beyond the ordinary reach of childhood learning. Occasionally, they would mention people who had disappeared or been forgotten entirely, recounting small details, clothing, mannerisms, even whispered last words that could not possibly have been remembered by anyone still alive. This precocity carried an uncanny weight. Parents visiting the school found themselves uneasy when Edith and Flora mentioned ancestors they had never spoken of, or townsfolk whose names had been erased from memory, as though the girls had peered into private histories and plucked the truth from the past. Even the most skeptical adults could not dismiss the certainty in the sisters' voices, the way their eyes seemed to glint with understanding, as if every story had been absorbed not from books or speech but from some unseen record kept in the folds of the world. Their knowledge was not just vast, it was alive, immediate, and impossible to ignore, suggesting that Edith and Flora were connected to a history far older and more secret than anyone had ever suspected, leaving the town both fascinated and quietly afraid of what else they might reveal. As curiosity about the girls' origins grew, a social worker was assigned to trace Edith and Flora's birth records, hoping to unravel the mystery that had quickly enveloped the town. What should have been a simple search for names and dates instead revealed a maze of contradictions and impossibilities. Church registries, long considered the most reliable source of documentation, offered no clear answers. Entries that should have recorded their births were either absent or strangely altered. Names, dates, and sponsors seemed to shift with each record consulted, as if someone or something had been deliberately erasing their presence from history while simultaneously ensuring the girls existed somewhere on paper. The more the social worker delved, the less sense the documents made. Pages were missing, ink appeared smudged in peculiar patterns, and older copies of the records contradicted newer ones, creating a web of uncertainty that refused simple explanation. Attempts to cross-reference with census data yielded nothing. Edith and Flora were absent from family trees that should have included them. Neighboring households had no recollection of the families supposedly responsible for their upbringing, and older townspeople were either unwilling or unable to provide coherent answers. Even the few references that did exist seemed off, as though they had been hastily inserted into old ledgers, repeating the sisters' names in strange cycles, almost ritualistic, as if the town itself had been edited to accommodate their existence. No midwife could be located, no baptismal witness remembered them, and yet the girls were here, alive and inexplicably intact, moving through the world as though they had always belonged. The church records were the most disturbing. They traced their names back generations, appearing at irregular intervals that made no genealogical sense. Edith and Flora's names surfaced in places and times before their supposed births, attached to events and families that could not possibly have produced them. The repetition suggested that either history itself had warped to accommodate them or that someone or something had ensured their story remained deliberately obscured. Each new discovery only deepened the sense of dread. The social worker began to notice a pattern. The further back she went, the more entwined the names became with local legends and unexplained disappearances, hints of families vanishing without trace, leaving behind whispers of children too beautiful to be human. Every attempt to confirm a simple fact became an exercise in futility. The lack of records, the alterations, the repeated and cyclical naming all hinted at an origin that defied ordinary understanding. It was as though Edith and Flora existed simultaneously in memory and erasure, their presence a living paradox that no amount of paperwork could resolve. By the time the social worker set aside her files late one night, she felt a creeping certainty that the girl's history was not meant to be uncovered, that something was deliberately keeping the truth hidden, and that the answers might lie not in the town's records, but in the shadows of the woods from which they had first emerged. As whispers spread through the town, the elders began to speak in tones both reverent and fearful, recalling old legends buried in the folds of Appalachian memory. There were stories, half forgotten and half feared, of children who did not belong entirely to the human world, children borrowed from the woods by forces no one could name and no one dared question. These tales were never told outright, passed instead in warnings and glances, a language of omission meant to protect the curious from prying too far into the forests that had long been regarded as sacred and dangerous. When Edith and Flora arrived, the resemblance was uncanny, pale, unnaturally composed, their eyes too dark, their knowledge too complete. The elders whispered that these were the children from the old stories, the ones who appeared at the edges of human settlements, too beautiful to belong, too quiet to be innocent. Some claimed to remember hearing the legends as children, that long ago, when the first settlers struggled to survive in the deep hollows, children would vanish without warning, their names repeated in later generations as if history itself refused to let them go. They were said to emerge years later in unfamiliar towns, untouched by time or hardship, bearing knowledge of the dead and the lost, speaking in voices both familiar and impossibly ancient. Edith and Flora, the elders insisted in hushed conversation, were the embodiment of these tales. Their calm, their composure, their strange connection to events past and present, it was all exactly as the stories had promised, an echo of an age-old pattern that no one alive could fully explain. The younger generation laughed at first, dismissing the elders as superstitious, yet laughter faltered when small, inexplicable events began to follow the sisters. Animals still shied from them. Mirrors cracked. Whispers drifted through empty rooms. The stories that had seemed like folklore now seemed to carry warning. People began to pay attention to the details the elders had insisted were vital: how the children emerged from the forest alone, how they never aged in ways ordinary children did, and how their presence seemed to bend the rules of reality subtly around them. Even those who remained skeptical could not ignore the uncanny precision with which the girls mirrored the legends. Names, behaviors, and even timing aligned too closely with the old warnings. Elders muttered that the woods themselves had chosen to return the children, to place them among humans only for observation, for influence, or perhaps for judgment. Every tale they recalled painted the sisters not as ordinary children but as something in between, straddling worlds, embodying both beauty and danger, innocence and power, a living proof that some mysteries, no matter how deeply hidden, refuse to remain buried when the right eyes appear to see them. The second fire struck without warning, a blaze that seemed almost sentient in its speed and ferocity. This time, it consumed the farmhouse where Edith and Flora had been temporarily placed, a home thought safe and ordinary, far from the charred ruins of the cabin that had first introduced them to the town. Neighbors ran toward the smoke, hearts pounding, expecting to find tragedy repeated, yet as before, no screams greeted them, no bodies were found among the collapsing beams and burning furniture. The fire roared and hissed, devouring everything in its path, yet when it finally died down, the farmhouse was reduced to a skeletal shell, and the girls were gone. Only their faint footprints led calmly away from the ruins, tracing a path into the forest as if the flames had guided them rather than trapped them. Those who followed the tracks could not ignore the unnatural precision in their movement. Each footprint was evenly spaced, careful, deliberate, betraying neither haste nor fear. Animals fled from the edges of the forest as search parties advanced, and the usual sounds of the woods, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds, the hum of insects, were absent. It was as though the forest itself had recognized their passage and held its breath, allowing only Edith and Flora to move freely. Whispers spread quickly. The girls were never touched by danger, never harmed, never in need of rescue. They simply moved through events that should have destroyed them, leaving nothing behind but the eerie certainty of their survival. The townspeople, already unsettled by the first fire, felt an escalating dread. How could children survive something so catastrophic twice in the same year? The questions were impossible to answer. Those who had briefly observed the sisters' behavior in the farmhouse described a calm, almost ritualistic demeanor, as though they had understood the fire before it began, predicting its path and escaping it by an instinct no human could possess. Others speculated that the flames themselves had obeyed some invisible command, sparing the girls while consuming all else. Every theory seemed inadequate, yet every witness agreed on one point: Edith and Flora did not flee in panic, they moved with purpose, guided by an unseen force that neither fear nor smoke could disturb. As night fell and the fire's aftermath smoldered, the search parties followed the footprints deeper into the forest, chasing shadows that seemed almost aware of their pursuit. The deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. The air grew colder, the trees denser, and the underbrush seemed to close in, masking the trail. By dawn, the footprints vanished near a grove that locals had long avoided, a place steeped in superstition, where the compass faltered and sounds were swallowed by the thick canopy. Edith and Flora were gone again, leaving nothing but questions and the unnerving knowledge that whatever survived the flames had done so by forces no one dared name, forces that waited quietly among the trees. The search parties pressed on, following the faint footprints left by Edith and Flora through the dense forest, but with every step, the woods seemed to resist their intrusion. The trails that had appeared clear moments before twisted in impossible ways, leading the hunters and volunteers in circles that defied logic. Moss-covered roots tangled like veins beneath their feet, and the underbrush thickened until movement became slow, laborious, and disorienting. Compasses spun uselessly, needles trembling without settling, and every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, then swallowed by the trees. Birds fell silent, as though the very life of the forest had paused to watch the girls' passage. The men and women tracking them began to speak less, whispering theories in hushed tones, fear curdling in their stomachs, yet the footprints ahead remained precise, leading steadily toward a destination none dared name. The deeper the searchers went, the more the forest itself felt alive, almost sentient, reacting to their presence. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and glimpses of movement flitted just beyond the periphery of vision, vanishing when anyone attempted to focus. The air grew heavy, carrying a damp, earthy scent tinged with smoke from the previous fire, though no flames remained. Some of the party insisted they could hear whispering voices, low and indistinct, speaking in a tongue that seemed both familiar and wrong. Anxiety took root as those voices seemed to mimic their own thoughts, echoing fears back to them in subtle, insidious ways. Even the most experienced woodsmen began to question their perception, afraid that exhaustion or fear was distorting reality. As the party neared an ancient grove, one long avoided by locals for reasons unspoken but deeply understood, the footprints simply vanished. There was no trail leading further, no sign that the girls had continued on, only the thickening shadows and the oppressive silence of the grove itself. Legends whispered by elders described such places, pockets of the forest where the natural order weakened, where time and sound bent unnaturally, where travelers could step in and be swallowed by the land itself. Those who had grown up fearing the woods now felt the truth of those tales pressing on them with undeniable weight. Some claimed to see faint glimmers of movement between the trunks, shadows too deliberate to belong to wind or animals. Others reported a sudden, inexplicable chill, a sensation of being watched by eyes that were neither human nor animal. The searchers emerged from the grove exhausted, shaken, and haunted, their questions unanswered. It became clear that Edith and Flora had led themselves into a place beyond ordinary comprehension, a threshold where the forest claimed control and humans were left to guess at the forces at work. The girls were not simply hiding, they were disappearing into a space that defied the laws of the town, the woods, and perhaps reality itself, leaving the trackers with only a growing sense of unease and the unshakable certainty that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Years passed, but Edith and Flora never truly left the consciousness of the town. Stories of their appearances in the forest persisted, whispered cautiously at kitchen tables and around campfires, each retelling growing in the hush of fear and fascination. Hikers and hunters traveling the old trails occasionally reported glimpses of two young women standing between the trees, motionless and pale, watching silently from the shadows. They never approached, never spoke, yet their presence carried a weight that made the air thick, heavy with a strange, unnameable tension. Those who saw them described a sense of recognition, as if the girls already knew every thought, every secret of the observer, and the fleeting encounters left hearts pounding and minds unsettled for days. The girls appeared unchanged by time, their faces holding the same impossible symmetry, the same deep, knowing eyes. Even as years stretched on and the town aged, Edith and Flora remained as they had first been seen, untouched by life's passage, immune to the wear of seasons and hardship. Those who encountered them claimed that looking directly into their eyes was like staring at the forest itself, ancient, patient, indifferent, yet intensely aware. Children who wandered too close would sometimes vanish for hours, returning pale and silent, carrying stories of faint whispers and soft hands that guided them along unseen paths, and in every case, Edith and Flora had been glimpsed nearby. The forest around the grove had changed little, resisting encroachment from roads, logging, or settlement, as though guarding something far older than human memory.